Okay, good morning, everybody. I think we can get started. I'm very excited to give a general introduction to our wonderful speaker today, and then Doug Opal will give a more specific introduction about Dr. Jagsi. Gender inequity in medicine and academic research has rightly become a focal point of discussion and action in the recent years. The challenges posed by inequity and harassment are not just ethical concerns, they can significantly impact the quality of care and the integrity of research outcomes. Therefore, addressing these issues through formal training and education is essential for fostering an inclusive and effective academic and professional environment. So we're very thrilled to welcome Dr. Jagsi at SCRI today. As an internationally renowned expert in gender equity in medicine and academia, her insights and contributions to this field are invaluable. Dr. Jagsi's commitment to addressing gender disparities aligns with our vision for a more equitable future in pediatric research and healthcare. Her presence today marks an important first step towards implementing initiatives focused on gender equity within SCRI. We look forward to engaging with her expertise and exploring strategies that can enhance our understanding and response to these critical issues. Together, we can work towards creating a more inclusive and supportive environment for all professionals in the medical and research communities. Doug?
Thank you, Vittorio, and great to see everybody here in person, and welcome to those who joined online. My name is Doug Opal. I'm the director of the Treuman Katz Center for Pediatric Bioethics and Palliative Care. I have a few sort of housekeeping items, and then I want to say a few words about Treuman Katz, for whom this lecture is named, and then I'll introduce our speaker, Dr. Jagsi. You see here that this session will be recorded. This is really for internal purposes only, and we are going to stop the recording at the end of Dr. Jagsi's lecture before question and answer period. So I wanted to make that fully transparent to you all. We also have till 10:45. It's longer than the standard hour for a lecture. So we do anticipate 20 or so minutes for questions and answers afterwards, and going all the way to 10:45. So it's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jagsi and welcome you all to our 18th annual Treuman Katz Lectureship. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional unceded land of the Coast Salish people, including the Duwamish people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. And this acknowledgement certainly does not take place of the authentic relationships we all have and seek with indigenous communities, but does serve as one way to honor the land we are on. So just a few words about Treuman Katz, for whom this lecture is named. As many of you know, he was president and CEO of Children's for over 20 years and really was recognized for his visionary leadership and his financial stewardship of the institution, securing broad-based community support for the hospital and its mission, and really building new and innovative programs to meet the diverse health needs of children, like regional clinics that brought our specialty healthcare to where children and families lived. A few of his many accomplishments included developing sort of a model medical school affiliation between Children's and the University of Washington, creating this Seattle Cancer Care Alliance, and really being involved in the planning that prompted the development of this building and amazing research institute we're in today. Treuman was also very interested in ethics, had a long-standing interest in quality of care and respecting the role of families. He had an emerging appreciation of the role clinical research played in advancing pediatric healthcare and how ethics was sort of foundational to that. So was very committed to developing the first Center for Pediatric Bioethics. And in 2004, the Seattle Children's Board of Trustees, in honor of Treuman, did found the Treuman Katz Center for Pediatric Bioethics, now the Treuman Katz Center for Pediatric Bioethics and Palliative Care. And as part of that, began this annual lectureship in his name. So thank you to the board, and thank you to Treuman. So on to introducing our esteemed speaker today, Dr. Jagsi. It's truly an honor and pleasure to have Dr. Jagsi with us here today. She's the Lawrence W. Davis Professor and Chair of the Department of Radiation Oncology at Emory University. She's been an international leader in gender equity, and specifically, I'll say, in establishing gender equity in medicine and science as a matter of ethics. She's led seminal studies quantifying underrepresentation of women in authorship, editorial positions, principal investigator positions, leadership positions in medicine and in comparable compensation. She's identified causal mechanisms and led and evaluated interventions to target those mechanisms, like a program to mentor and support those with extra professional caregiving demands, institutional report cards on equity metrics, blinding of peer review, and transparent policies on promotion, compensation, and leave. Dr. Jagsi is the author of over 400 publications and is the PI on multiple NIH grants. Dr. Jagsi is a clinical trialist and health services researcher. She's recognized for her research to strengthen autonomy in breast cancer patients and to individualize breast cancer care. She's currently a member of the National Academy's Committee on Women in Science, Medicine, and Engineering, and has received many honors for her research, including from the Association of American Medical Colleges, the American Medical Association, and the American Medical Women's Association. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jagsi.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here with you today in person. I had the honor of delivering this lecture during the pandemic when I had a virtual audience, and I have to say it's so much more meaningful when we get to interact and connect in person. And so what I'm going to discuss with you today is a little bit of the evidence about the nature and causes of inequity in our profession. I'm going to present some evidence collected by our group and others that shows that this is not simply due to a slow but intact and functional pipeline, and in fact reflects the differential impact of challenges that women are disproportionately likely to confront, including unconscious biases, gendered expectations of society, and overt discrimination and harassment. I'll then reflect just a bit with this audience on why this is a matter of ethics, and then turn to evidence-based interventions that we all can consider and implement in our own environments to really advance the way that we address this challenge that is holding all of us back from achieving our mission. So women in the medical profession among physicians have not always been in the majority. We are now among medical students. Women are the majority of medical students today. But it was actually not until Title IX in 1972 that medical schools were prohibited from discriminating against women in hiring, in promotions, and in admissions decisions. And so only after Title IX do you see that dramatic increase in women's participation. And what you can see is that as of the early 1990s, women had broken 40%. So I matriculated medical school in 1995 myself. And what I can say is that when I matriculated to medical school, my medical school class was heralded as the second year in a row that that medical school class had had more than 50% women. Okay, it wasn't just until a few years ago that the overall national statistics reached that, but at that medical school, it was considered a pretty big deal. And they waited until the second year to make a big deal about it and publish it in the Boston Globe and things like that because they thought maybe the first year was a fluke. But then they realized that this was a stable change. And when we entered as medical students, most of us thought in 1995 that the challenges of gender inequity had been solved by our mother's generation, that there had been prior waves of feminism that had made so many tremendous advances that we're all familiar with. And so many of us thought that this was an issue that would work itself out with time. But I'm going to show you some evidence that suggests that's not actually what has happened. This is a figure that just came out this late summer from the AAMC. Every few years, they'll update their reports on the representation of women in academic medicine. And every few years, I wait for it's finally better and I can stop flying all around the country to give this talk. And sadly, this is this year's information. So what you can see is women are now the majority of the beginning of the pipeline, right? Over half of our applicants and our graduates. And yet still only about a quarter of our deans, health system leaders, and chairs. Right now at my institution, I am the only woman who is a permanent clinical department chair. Now, there are basic science department chairs who are women. I am joined by a colleague who's an interim chair who's a woman, and there's an incoming chair who is a woman. So this is about to change. And what I'd like to see is for that to change everywhere that this is an issue. Because it is challenging to feel like the only in any room. And so when I was a resident, and I thought that this was not particularly a thing, never took a women's studies class in my life. This was definitely not going to be my area of scholarly interest. But the new leader of the Office of Women's Careers at Massachusetts General Hospital was a woman named Nancy Tarbell, who went on to become the executive vice dean for clinical and academic affairs at Harvard Medical School, brilliant mentor and leader, and she was a pediatric radiation oncologist. And I wanted to be a pediatric radiation oncologist. I wanted to grow up and be Nancy Tarbell. And when I was rotating with Nancy on pediatrics, and I know I'm speaking to a pediatric audience, and I just want to speak to you about just how much I honor and admire what you do, I found it the most difficult thing I'd ever done. And I said to Nancy, I don't think I can do pediatric radiation oncology. I think I'm a breast cancer doc. And I am, in fact, now a breast cancer doc. And Nancy looked at me, and instead of saying, no, we recruited you here, you're here to be my protege, I'm sure you can find the resilience within you to enjoy pediatric radiation oncology, she said, we'll figure out something else we'll work on together. She said, I've been named the head of the Office of Women's Careers here. They needed to recruit her over. It's a fascinating story. The two sides of Harvard Medical School had separate radiation oncology departments, and so they had recruited over her husband to become the director of the Proton Center, and he became the chair of the department. And they needed something equally impressive to lure her over. And so she was named the head of the Office of Women's Careers. And what she said was, I'm doing all of this work, and I'm realizing that unlike what we do in medicine, where we identify root causes and mechanisms and then we target them with interventions, this is a field where there's not a lot of data. You've got a doctorate in social policy. You probably know how to actually generate these data, evaluate and guide these programs. This could be a really interesting opportunity for you to make a difference. Right? Brilliant mentors like identify, define a possible niche for you. I was like, well, but isn't that all like worked out already by my mom's generation and you? And so she said, well, maybe not. Why don't you start coming to my meetings? And so I ended up becoming a member of her Women in Academic Medicine Committee. And at the end of one of the meetings, I said, I do agree that there's something somewhat disheartening about opening, or not even opening, look at the cover of the New England Journal of Medicine, which at the time used to list the first and last names of the authors, and not seeing names other than Lawrence and Henry and David. And I wasn't expecting to see Reshma. I was just hoping to see Mary or Helen or Nancy. And so, I wonder if there's any data on that. And there's one thing that you can do when you're a junior person in the field, right? You can count things. So I was like, okay. I'm going to go, these were the days, people who do, and I now do a lot of bibliometric collaborations with very sophisticated people who have access to much more robust data sets. I pulled down issue after issue off of the walls of Countway Library, and I created a database to count. And what we found was that women were in a small minority of not only the authors of research in the most prominent medical journals, but also among those who were invited to contribute editorials and editorial board members who guide the direction that the field takes, right? We all know this. When you write an editorial or you're on an editorial board, you can say, hey, there's going to be a theme issue on this, or you can say in your editorial, here's where research should go. And so when you have that privileged position, you have so much influence over the field. And one of the most interesting things that was published by a journalist who was smart enough not to interview just me as the author of the paper, but to interview the editor who accepted the paper at the New England Journal. What she wrote was a quote from the editor who said, because she said to the editor something along the lines of, "Doesn't this make you guys kind of look bad? Why'd you publish this?" And she said, "Oh, it doesn't make us look bad because this is reflecting something that's happening way before women get to the point of writing a paper worthy of publishing in the New England Journal of Medicine." And I think that's partly true. I do think there's also evidence about blinding of peer review. You know, we do unblinded, or we do single-blinded peer review, right? Usually the reviewers know the identities of the authors. The authors don't usually know the identities of the reviewers. And you know, we know that when orchestra auditions were unblinded, that we thought as a society that orchestras were all male because women physiologically couldn't play musical instruments as well as men. We thought, you know, it was something about the lung capacity to blow into wind instruments, or that, you know, perhaps the finger span wasn't broad enough to play Rachmaninoff, right? But actually, and by the way, I have a very broad finger span and I play the piano. When they introduced two simple interventions, a screen to blind the evaluator from the auditioner's identity, and a carpet, which was necessary to cloak the sound of the heels of the shoes. Then we as a society discovered that women actually sound like they can play music. They just don't look like they can play music, right? And so I would push back a little bit on nothing's within the control of journals. And actually the journal in my field, the International Journal of Radiation Oncology, Biology, and Physics, implemented a system of double-blinded peer review that was actually very successful. There's a lot of arguments against why why journals can't do peer review. You can't effectively blind it. It'll dissatisfy people. It's burdensome. It actually worked out pretty well. We have an evaluation study because I was on the editorial board at the time. Remember, editorial board members have influence. And we were able to, and I know it's an ethics audience, we were able to coerce. We weren't coercing. We said, if you want to submit within this very short 3-month period of time, you will fill out this survey telling us about your experience with blinding, both for the reviewers and for the submitters. And we figured it wasn't coercive because you could submit after 3 months and not be forced to fill out our survey. But we got 100% of the authors and the reviewers to fill out surveys about their experiences. And again, double blinding is effective, but double blinding doesn't address all of those upstream factors. And so I do think that that editor was right, that there are so many other things that are preventing women from getting to this point. And so, of course, Nancy, as a good mentor, said, you know, you might want to dig into those. That's a really interesting thing to take with you. And so if I don't show this slide, someone will usually ask me at the end, so I'll just show this, whether there's a study that has actually looked at cohorts of people over time rather than looking at cross-sectional slices of data. And in fact, Lynn Nonemaker did one of those back in 2000, where she looked at 15 cohorts of medical school graduates between 1979 and 1993. And what she found was that the proportion of women who reached the rank of associate professor was significantly lower than expected in all but 2 of the cohorts she studied, and that even those who reached the rank of associate professor, those women were less likely to become full professors than their male counterparts. It was not a small difference. The difference between observed and expected was 5 to 1. Okay, big difference. But it was medical school graduates from 1979 to 1993. We saw that women became over 40% of the medical student body right around 1993. Maybe this all transformed when my class, that was over 50% female, came through. And we needed further research to address that challenge. Kimber Richter and colleagues can be thanked for doing a similar analysis with these data. And unfortunately, even though they extended through 2013, they did not find any narrowing of the gap with the inclusion of more recent cohorts of medical students. The other big criticism of this kind of analysis of data is that it combines apples and oranges, because not everyone goes into academic medicine for the same reasons. We have different tracks. Perhaps women are more likely to be pursuing clinician educator tracks. That's consistent with the ways that we socialize little girls to exhibit communal caretaking behaviors and little boys to exhibit agentic behaviors. And so perhaps men are going to be more likely to pursue research tracks. And in fact, if you look at who is on tenure tracks at medical schools, as Julia Files and colleagues did at the Mayo Clinic, you can show that women are less well represented on traditional tenure tracks than on clinician educator tracks. So perhaps the issue here isn't that similarly situated, apt, and motivated men and women are having different outcomes, but rather that we in medical schools don't value certain aspects of the mission as much as we value others. And so we could look at that. And so that's what took me to spend much of my career studying a certain group of career development awardees. I studied K awardees with K08 and K23 awards, which are made to individuals with clinical doctorates, and these are national level awards, not locally decided awards. And so they're incredibly competitive. There's no affirmative action in the process, and women were only a minority of the K awardees. But these are people who got typically at least 50, but most of the time, 75% of their time protected for research. They had to articulate a mentorship plan. Considerable societal resources were invested in them being able to develop their careers to become independent investigators. And actually becoming an independent investigator is the articulated goal and endpoint that the K Award program seeks to support. And what we found when we looked at the publicly available data that was in what was called then the CRISP system, it's now called NIH Reporter, and no one had ever done this kind of analysis. So NIH had certainly been concerned about this, and they've done admirable work, and in fact ultimately ended up funding our work. But they had looked at the per applicant rates. They were looking for bias in their own processes, things within their own control, right? So does an application that comes in from a woman do worse in peer review than an application that comes in from a man? But they didn't look at whole human beings. And so we looked at whole human beings using actuarial analysis because, again, I'm an oncologist and this is how I think about the whole world. And I was told by a colleague who's an oncologist that this was actually really great that an oncologist decided to do this kind of work because here's a situation where there's a good surrogate endpoint for survival. Survival in academic medicine depends on converting your K to an R, right? And so we looked at this and we saw the curve separate like I had some kind of wonderful treatment, right? If I had a treatment, wouldn't we all this would be a big deal if this were a treatment. But of course, this was gender, and I will admit that at the time we used crude binary gender, and I will come back to this later in my talk. But we used binary gender, and binary gender was, that was based on analysis of first names. And by the way, we also, if you ever want to do an analysis like this, we showed that women were actually very unlikely to change their surnames due to marriage or divorce after getting a K award. So once you get to the point of reaching career success with a certain name, you're very unlikely to change that name. We did have to investigate that. A wonderful research associate named Amy Motomura, who's now a law professor. I think I may have scared her away from our field a little bit, but she spent a whole year gathering the data to make sure that we didn't, for example, see that Mary Smith got a K award, and then we looked at every single subsequent R award with the first name Mary to make sure that she didn't get an R1 under a different last name. Gender was, so if you do this kind of research, you can just cite Amy's lovely appendix to this paper, and you don't, I think, have to replicate that. Gender was independently significant even after we did a multivariable analysis that controlled for everything we could in the publicly available data. So we had K award type, which K08s were laboratory-oriented awards, K23s were patient-oriented awards. We controlled for the year of the award because women were gradually increasing as a proportion of K awardees over time, and the funding environment was getting harder over time. We controlled for the funding institute because women were less likely to apply to the funding institutes like cancer, right, NCI, NHLBI, that have the most amounts of funding to devote to independent awards. We controlled for institution. Women were less well represented at the institutions that had higher amounts of extramural funding. So maybe the environment was what was being scored down. And we also controlled for specialty. And as you can see, gender still had a highly significant hazard ratio of 0.8. So then we decided to look a little more closely And we surveyed K awardees, and this was my career development award supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, where we looked at K awardees who held MD degrees. Remember, K08s and 23s are clinician researchers, but some of them hold other types of clinical doctorates. So over 80% are MDs. We focused on them and we looked at what their productivity was first. That was actually the primary point, and that's why we have all of this information, was we looked at whether maybe they were succeeding in some way that we hadn't measured with R01 attainment, because we all know R01s aren't the only grants. So maybe they were getting other big grants. Maybe they were pulling together large teams. I mean, that would be consistent with some of the evidence about the talents that grow from those who exhibit communal behaviors well. Maybe it was that women were closing the deal. So they weren't writing the new grant, they were writing the paper on the old grant, but they were still making scholarly contributions. I mean, my data from the prior study suggested that might not be the explanation, but this was my study to answer every single reviewer comment on the prior paper, right? This is how we do research, right? Well, we could do a research study on whether you're right, but for now, I'll just put it in the limitations. Future research should investigate whether maybe the promising K awardees who are women are just such rare superstars that we immediately promote them to become division chiefs or department chairs. And so they're responsible for the scholarly success of many people, and they don't actually get their own R01 grants, but they are responsible for so much more. Well, we could look at that. Turns out, no, that's not the case. And so we published a paper that showed that even if we broadened the definition of academic success beyond R01 attainment, that women were less likely to have attained that success than men. But then, since we had survey data, we also asked them about their compensation. And we hypothesized that the difference in compensation that had been documented in many prior studies, but those prior studies had lacked information about granular behaviors and identity characteristics, that the difference in compensation would actually not be driven very much by any of those things and would be driven primarily by specialty. Many of the prior studies had actually been single specialty studies or had lacked information about specialty. And we all know that specialty has a profound impact on physicians' compensation. And so we found that. We actually found that about half the difference in compensation that we observed in this sample. The men were making about $200,000 a year. The women were making about $168,000 at the time. About half of that $32,000 difference was explained by specialty alone. And then when we looked at all these factors, which as you can see are the kinds of things that get thrown out as reasons that might be justifiable differences in compensation that exist, didn't explain away the difference. There was still a residual difference in compensation. And so we began to reflect on why that might be. So I mentioned that specialty matters, but it's important not to think of that as choice. That's why choice is in quotation marks, because this is not just a freely willed choice made in isolation. Women may be encouraged to occupy lower paid specialties, and specialties chosen by women may pay less, partly because they're predominated by women or because they involve less valued feminine behaviors. So there's this phenomenon of occupational gender segregation. The feminine behaviors are those communal behaviors of caretaking, right? Evaluation and management services, care of women and children. Okay, I know I'm preaching to the choir because I'm in a pediatrics audience, right? There's actually a study that we did, and I should have actually put that in my slide set. I'm just realizing. That was published in JAMA Pediatrics that actually looked at compensation within pediatric specialties. And why would we pay a pediatric anesthesiologist less than an adult anesthesiologist? They're sticking a tube in a smaller hole. They're actually doing something harder, right? There is no reason to compensate pediatric specialists less than their adult counterparts. And women are in the majority of pediatric caregiving specialties. So there's a lot of weird stuff that goes on in the way that we reward people with compensation at work. There's also differences in productivity, in hours, and in willingness to change institutions. Again, I don't think this is a freely willed choice because, of course, we all function within a gender-structured society, and our society expects women to partner with men, and please do hear me that I'm not saying I expect women to partner with men. We expect women to partner with men, and we expect those men to be at or above the woman's age and at or above the woman's educational status. So even In two physician couples where you have the same educational status, because of the at or above their age thing, the woman often ends up being the trailing spouse. And in subsequent studies we've done with K awardees, we've shown that if you ask these K awardees who are rock stars, who got these nationally competitive awards, whose career comes first, the women are much more likely to say, in my family, my husband's career is the priority, rather than saying their two are equal in priority or that mine comes first. So that's a challenge. And if the way that you're able to increase your compensation is by making a credible threat to leave your organization, then that will be more challenging for the individuals who have a partner whose career is at least as important as their own, right? She'll never leave. And so if you can't come in with a credible threat to negotiate up your compensation, that's really not a justifiable reason to pay someone less. Differences in rank and leadership positions are also important. Now, we did control for rank and leadership positions in this analysis, and by doing so, we actually make the most conservative and overly conservative estimate of what is unjustified. Because if you say all differences in rank and leadership are justifiable reasons for paying someone less, then your process for advancing people in rank and to leadership positions had better embrace all best practices for transparent posting, searches, criterion-based evaluation. And we know that sometimes leadership positions end up being a double whammy, because let's say Jane and John were hired around the same time. They're roughly equally productive. They're at a public institution, so they can actually see one another's compensation. And for years, they actually make roughly the same. And then one year, Jane looks and she says, wow, John's making a lot more than me. And she goes into the department chair's office, Bob, and she says, Bob, why is John all of a sudden making so much more than me? Oh, yeah, remember I made him the division chief, so that's why he makes more, because he's the division chief. And Jane says, but you didn't even post the division chief position. He said, nah, I was playing golf with John over the weekend before I decided to create that division, and he was telling me about all the wonderful work he was doing, and I thought he's such a good guy, I should put him in that role. So yeah, no, it didn't really occur to me to post the position, and but now that he's doing the job, of course I have to pay him more. It's a double whammy for Jane, because she never got to have the opportunity to be considered for the leadership role and have the influence in the leadership role, and now it's used to justify paying her less too. And even after you over-control, right, we controlled for those things, there's a substantial unexplained gender difference. So what else could be going on? Well, there can be differences in values or behavior. Maybe mothers are being asked to sacrifice pay for unobserved job characteristics, like family flexibility, not having to take unsociable shifts or on-call. Fathers are trying to earn more to support their families. But here we're not talking about the heavily clinically focused individuals. This is a relatively homogeneous job type of primarily research-oriented faculty, and we didn't find an interaction between gender and parental status. Even the women without children had lower pay than men. Now, all of us know that women don't only provide caregiving for family members who are children. Women are also disproportionately likely to provide caregiving for family members who are older. There was an economist named Anthony Losasso who saw this study when it came out in JAMA and gave a comment to a journalist and said, there's got to be something that they didn't measure about preferences for family flexibility. And to his credit, in Health Affairs, a couple years ago, he got the data. And he looked in a sample of starting physicians in New York State. And he looked at their starting salaries, and he was able to survey them about their preferences for family flexibility. And he was actually able to replicate these exact findings. So specialty explained half, and actually preferences for family flexibility didn't explain any of the difference in that study either. Here's another really interesting one, though. Women don't ask, right? So there's a famous book by Babcock and Lashover that details the abundant social scientific evidence that negotiation behaviors differ by gender. And in fact, it's probably a good thing that they do, because if women exhibit the same behaviors as men in negotiation scenarios, they can be penalized for doing so. So I try in talks like this, because I can see it's a relatively senior audience. We are not here trying to fix ourselves. We're not trying to fix individual women. We're trying to fix systems together. But one way, this isn't me saying you should read this book if you haven't read this book. And in fact, I wouldn't read that book because it's kind of depressing, because it just tells you that women don't ask. They have a sequel that's called Ask for It. that actually details strategies that individuals can use regardless of their gender. And because we don't tend to teach negotiation to medical students or to science doctoral students, many of our proteges have never understood that negotiation is not the same as buying a used car. In fact, we did a qualitative study with K awardees, and this was a theme that came out, was this tremendous naivete about what negotiation even was. And that typically there's not just two dimensions that you're negotiating over, right? In a used car, either the seller gets a higher price and the buyer loses, or vice versa, right? And you're never going to interact again. It's a one-time kind of interaction. Usually, you're going to have repeated interactions. There are many axes, and if you come together and you engage in something called principled negotiation, which was developed by professors at Harvard Law School, described in a landmark book called Getting to Yes, if you engage in principled negotiation, you think about the other party's needs, you ask questions, you put yourself in their shoes, you endeavor to identify opportunities for shared gains, you look for what your mutual interests are. That can be very effective, and even having one party skilled in that will elevate the outcome of the negotiation. We have to equip our younger colleagues with the resources they need to succeed, or we won't be successful in our mission, right? So I give a lot of negotiation talks to younger people in the field of radiation oncology, and since I became a department chair, I've been getting a very consistent question, which is like, wow, why would a department chair want to tell us who are about to negotiate with her how to negotiate effectively? And I said, because my goal, my only success, is your success. So if I don't know what it takes for you to succeed, we both fail. And so this is, I think, something that we can all do to elevate our ability to achieve our mission. And it'll help address, I was talking with someone before this session about, differences in startup packages. So there was a study published in JAMA that looked, it was a funding organization on the East Coast that had access to data. One of the things they asked about was, for people applying for career development awards from us, we want to know how much your institution put into their startups. And they're like, wow, looks like the women get smaller startups than the men. So they documented it in JAMA. The women were getting smaller startups. And so it's not just about compensation, it's about startup packages, the resources necessary to succeed. And I heard somebody else say before this, when I negotiate for my salary to go up, it's not because I want the money, it's because I'm trying to create a culture where everybody is paid equitably. And that's admirable. It's also okay to want to be paid fairly yourself. And we discover that as the older I get, the more I realize that money makes the world go round. If you don't want the money for yourself, you can donate it to a cause. You can make the world a better place. You should have the authority to control the resources you've earned. There's also differences in employer behavior. So there's a phenomenon known as statistical discrimination, whereby the employers are making inferences that are based on group characteristics like mean productivity rather than individual characteristics when setting salaries. And there's a concept of the family wage, which is this idea that we all have, regardless of our gender, that assumes that there's a single male breadwinner at home and that we need to pay them enough to support their family. And so when a man comes into our office and they have needs, and we know they've got kids in college and they're trying to, they've got a non-working spouse, we know what that money is going towards. And when a woman walks into our office and her partner is actually on the faculty of our institution as well, we think, well, does she really need it as much? And that is not what we should be doing when we're setting salaries. And so ultimately, these and many other factors that I'm going to turn to in my subsequent slides conspire in the systems of compensation in academic medicine to disadvantage women. So we see not only does negotiation and that occupational gender segregation affect the base salary, but then productivity differs, and we have greater organizational service from women. There's often invisible service, and I'll come back to this in a later slide. There are more domestic duties and part-time work, increased time with patients, which, by the way, also has a salutary impact on the health outcomes of our patients. pregnancy and maternity leaves, and again, I will come to those in subsequent slides. There are rank and seniority issues that we've talked about that reflect unconscious biases, and the leadership premium that exists and systems and processes for advancement and sponsorship that currently are not equitable. Ultimately, unconscious bias is one of the most important drivers of this. There was a National Academies of Sciences report in 2006 called Beyond Bias that talked about the deeply ingrained notions we all have regardless of our own gender, and the impressive body of controlled experimental studies and examination of decision-making processes in real life that show that on the average, people are less likely to hire a woman than a man with identical qualifications. They are less likely to ascribe credit to a woman than a man for identical accomplishments, and when information is scarce, far more often give the benefit of the doubt to a man than a woman. So the classic study design here is the blinded CV study, evaluate a CV of a man named Brian Miller, a woman named Karen Miller. This was an actual study led by academic psychologist Steinprice and colleagues. And Karen Miller is less likely to be hired than Brian Miller. But they asked their colleagues, they said, this is a sham CV. We're psychologists, we know how we do this stuff. We're just trying to figure out what people prioritize in hiring and promotion processes. So would you tell us, not only would you hire this person, but would you just rate them for their objective qualifications based on this CV? Okay, the CV every single participant got was the same. Only difference was the name at the top. Rate them for service, teaching, and scholarship. Karen Miller actually has worse teaching, service, and scholarship than Brian Miller. So, it's just a merit-based decision there that we don't hire. Same CV. And it's been replicated in academic medicine, in the hiring of postdoctoral laboratory managers, and in truly the saddest study I have ever read, Emily and Greg are more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal. So much more so that Emily and Greg require 9 fewer years of experience on their CVs to get interviews at the same rates as Lakeisha and Jamal. So this brings me to the single most important slide in this entire talk, because up until now, I have largely been talking about gender as though it were binary, which we know it is not, and as though it were the only consideration and the only identity characteristic, which we know it is not. And there are many individuals who inhabit multiple marginalized identities. And for these individuals, the challenges that are faced are unique and exist at an intersection that can only be understood by speaking with those individuals. It is not simply an accumulation of disadvantages of, for example, racism and sexism. So let's just add the indignities of racism to the indignities of sexism. There is a unique form of racialized sexual harassment that exists that only Black women experience, or that only Asian women experience. There are unique indignities of inhabiting that intersection. And so it is not simply an addition of disadvantages, it is an accumulation of disadvantages, and this concept was pioneered by Kimberly Crenshaw in the legal literature, but needs to be appreciated by all of us. There have been a series of National Academies of reports. That first one from Beyond Bias that I just quoted from has been followed by numerous other reports that I'm going to just touch on briefly, and that have increasingly tried to apply that intersectional lens. So one recent report that we just published, I was part of this one in April of this year, March or April of this year, was that family caregiving is a real challenge, okay? There are seemingly gender-neutral norms, practices, and policies that have a disparate impact on women. And those include policies that limit leave from training. So you guys are pediatricians. You probably know that your AAP has endorsed policies to support paid parental leave, regardless of gender, for all human beings of 12 weeks in all professions, except maybe pediatric trainees, right? Right, and I say that, with a little bit of an eye roll, but we for years have said something is right for all of society, and yet have limited the leave that our own future colleagues are permitted to take and remain board eligible, are permitted to take and be qualified and have completed their residency training. And so I first wrote about this when I was a very pregnant chief resident, and while a very pregnant chief resident who happened to be the president of the National Association of Residents in Radiation Oncology, the American Board of Radiology came out and said, we're going to put in a 4-week per year limit on leave. And it's fine, if you want to take more than that, that's fine. Just, delay your board eligibility by a year. And the guy who sat next to me, I will say, to his credit, my colleague in the resident room said, holy wow, you're going to lose not your first year's entering compensation, you're going to lose your last year of compensation. You're never going to get to that last year. He's like, the financial hit you're going to take from delaying your board qualifications by a year, you can't do that. And here I was at an institution where actually it was a very, thank God for the Office of Women's Careers. I mean, there was a very civilized policy. I was going to be able to take 10 to 12 weeks off, right? My medical leave of 6 weeks if I had a vaginal delivery, 8 weeks if I had a C-section, plus my 4 weeks of vacation. And it was all worked out. And I was actually a really good clinical resident. No one had any concerns that I was not going to be qualified to be an attending. It was fine. And I was reassured by people who said, well, don't worry, we will figure something out. We've seen this happen in other specialties. We create parent-child electives. And I said, well, I guess I can understand how you could maybe create like a work from home parent-child elective for pediatrics. Like, okay, I'm going to learn. I can understand it in many specialties. What is the parent-child elective in radiation oncology? Like, don't radiate mothers or their infants? It seemed to me that there were a lot of problems with this policy, and so I wrote about it. I wrote an editorial. I first tried to write about it with like private letters to the ABR. I asked people to engage in a letter writing campaign. Nothing changed. And then an editorial helped change that policy. They didn't actually change the policy. They clarified the policy that said there would be discretion. And in fairness, they did say in the very beginning that it was 4 weeks. It was going to be 6 weeks for the senior class, my class, we were being grandfathered. But 6 weeks was not the 10 to 12 weeks that I had expected. And then they built in some provisions to clarify that there would be some flexibility for program director discretion. So then we ended up writing about it across specialties. And so that was that first paper in 2007. And we weren't actually able in that paper to talk about moving away from time-based considerations and moving more towards competency-based considerations in assessing what the appropriate time to graduate from residency training was. And it wasn't until over a decade later that we were actually able to make that argument. But we were eventually able to make that argument. It seemed absurd in 2007. So it was in our original draft. It was cut, and then it came back in 2019. So it just goes to show that we are making progress. And for anyone who is earlier in their career, you can seize on something in your own life experience and try to make the world better. And when you're ultimately in your 50s, maybe the world will start to get better. I'd like to see that progress rate accelerate a little bit. We also have some strange expectations regarding work hours. We try to be inclusive. We'll often do meetings very early in the morning or very late in the evening. And what we cause there is challenges for participation. We're trying to be inclusive, but we actually end up excluding certain groups. And so we have tenure clocks, limits on grant eligibility. Again, we disadvantage the groups that are more likely to take time off to care for family. And so this forced collision of biological and professional clocks and magnified inequities of the gender division of labor in our society are really problematic. They disadvantage women. And what you can see in this, which is my favorite study to show on this point, this is a survey of our K awardees who are my age. So I did another K awardee survey, and it was K awardees who got their new awards between 2006 and 2009, okay? They were in their early 40s when they answered this, and we asked them, how do you spend your time? And this is how labor economists think about time. There's paid labor, unpaid labor. So turns out the women were not having less total labor, but the women had less paid labor, and they were spending more time on parenting and domestic tasks. And in fact, even after we adjusted for work hours and spousal employment status and other factors, women were spending 8.5 more hours per week on these domestic activities. And that's important that we adjusted for spousal employment, because remember when I told you about the gendered expectations of society and how women partner with men who are in careers, we found that 90% of our respondents had partners who were full-time employed if they were women. We found that over 50% of the men had non-employed or part-time partners. So the very different life circumstances. But even after you adjusted for that, 8.5 more hours per week, and when we asked this question, which was long before the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, we said, what happens when your usual childcare arrangements are disrupted? And we did not mean like Ann Arbor Public Schools went down from March of 2020 to May of 2021 without a single day of in-person instruction. That was not what I was envisioning. It was snow day, kid too sick to go to daycare, nanny too sick to come in, something like that. And we said, who takes care of it? I typically do it myself. My spouse or partner typically does it. We share it. We have someone else we turn to. 42.6% of the women, 12.4% of the men said, I do it myself. So this speaks to some of the challenges that we then saw play out in the pandemic. These differences have real implications for burnout. We just hosted a symposium for burnout at the National Academies last week, and it does have disproportionate impact on burnout when we face these differential time pressures. There are many studies that look at work-related burnout, and if there are physicians in the sample, the finding is always, if it's a continuous score, the women are more burned out than the men. If it's a binary cutoff, a higher proportion of women are burned out than the men, that everybody's more burned out than we would like for them to be. These are any burnout study, those are always the findings. What was neat about the K awardee sample was that we were able, because we had an NIH R01 grant, we were able to survey them longitudinally, and we were able to look at what factors early in their K awards predicted for burnout later on. And what we found was that the gender differences in burnout later on could be explained entirely by those time pressure differences and by one other thing: differences in perceptions of work climate. So this is the now famous metaphor of an iceberg of sexual harassment, where when we say sexual harassment, people immediately think of the tip of the iceberg, sexual assault, coercive advances, but really the most common, the largest base of the iceberg behaviors are forms of conveying sexist hostility, sexist remarks, crude behaviors. And so we have to focus on the entire construct of sexual harassment, which does include the gender harassing behaviors that are the vast, most common behaviors that can have equally detrimental impact on the outcomes we all care about. So physical well-being, mental well-being, professional well-being, including things like absenteeism, tardiness, retention, all of these things are affected by gender harassment and not just overt tip of the iceberg behaviors. In medicine, this stuff actually does still happen. When we asked it in the most crude way you can ask, which is just a single item, have you ever encountered unwanted sexual comments, attention, or advances by a superior colleague? We asked it this way because the last time it had been asked of a national faculty sample in academic medicine had been 1995. And back in 1995, it was over half of the women had experienced this. So I thought, well, maybe it'll be better now. And glass half full, it was a little better now. It was 30%, but it was appalling. And this was published in 2016. And this was just as awareness of the Me Too movement was beginning. This was just as our presidential candidate then and now made some pretty infamous comments on Access Hollywood recordings. And it was a time when people were just starting to become aware of how marginalized women continue to be in our society, and the fact that my mother's generation didn't actually fix everything after all. And these behaviors were not without consequence. 60% perceived a negative impact on confidence in themselves as professionals. Nearly half reported that the experiences negatively affected their career advancement. We went on to measure it with the gold standard way of measuring sexual harassment. This is at the University of Michigan. This is past year sexual harassment, where we actually essentially show you the iceberg. We tell you the 20 behaviors in the sexual experiences questionnaire that constitute harassment and say, have you encountered unwanted behaviors that are blah, blah, blah. Look at this. Over half of the men and over 80% of the women are experiencing unwanted behaviors of this nature, okay? And over there on the right is a demonstration of some of those unique forms of racialized sexual harassment that differ across different intersecting identity groups. When we looked more recently at a sample of K awardees, now quite far into their careers, in fact, this is the sample that I showed you earlier for the domestic labor. This is my age people, okay? They are rating the civility of their work climate, even today, as unacceptable and varying by their identity characteristics. When I published that first paper in 2016, I got this lovely email from a colleague who said, you know, I've wondered if something was pathologically wrong with me, that I invited that kind of behavior. Was it that I wasn't smart enough? Was it because I was soft-spoken? Was it because there was something so wrong with me I couldn't even recognize it? I read your article with a mixture of simultaneous dismay and relief. Relief because if they've gone through similar things, then maybe I'm not defective. I don't think I can ever talk about my experiences, partially because of fear, partially because it seems ungrateful to do so. There is so much about the culture of medicine in this. And I said to her, this is so illuminating. You know, JAMA has a piece of my mind section. You should publish this. And she said, oh, no. And this is something I want to leave you with here. She said, no, I don't want to publish it because I don't want to be labeled with that as my identity. I spent my whole life becoming a scientist, becoming a physician. I'll be marginalized. I'll be stigmatized. I'll make myself vulnerable to retaliation. No, thanks. I don't know why I trust you, but you seem very trustworthy. Just, I know you can see my name. Don't ever tell anyone I wrote this, but feel free to share it. So here it is. Ultimately, there is an ethical imperative to act. There are both deontological and teleological arguments that can be articulated about the need to promote gender equity. We know that to demonstrate respect for persons qua persons, we absolutely must ensure that we are not engaging in behaviors that disadvantage certain groups based on group characteristics. It is not respectful of their dignity as individuals capable of rational thought, of freely willed action. It's simply wrong for its own sake, and we have a duty to treat one another with respect, full stop, right? All of us know this. There are also really powerful teleological arguments. We know that the direction that research takes depends on who's doing the research. We know that the quality of research is enhanced when we bring people who are diverse and have different life experiences and backgrounds together to interact. We know that clinical care is made better when women are included. We know that education is improved when there are role models for all those women who are coming behind us that make up 50% of the talent pool to see themselves in leadership positions. And so we have to address harassment by gathering data. And I am really admiring how much your institution has tried very recently to gather data, and would really encourage you to participate as much as possible in providing your perspectives, because I know that there is an inherent sense of not wanting to be the person who wrote that email, not wanting to be labeled with that, but also I hope a recognition of the duty to share our experiences so the organization can get better, because we have to inform our interventions with data that are generated locally. It's also incredibly important for our leaders to demonstrate their commitment to these issues. I think it's pretty cool that they invited me here to speak on this topic, even though I've already given a lecture for the Treuman Katz Lectureship in the past, because they said, it's partly because you're wonderful, Reshma, but it's mostly because the topic is so important, right? And that's really key. We need to also facilitate reporting and offer choices of complaint handlers, but also recognize that only a tiny minority, somewhere on the order of 10 to 15% in our data and in other studies, of people who experience harassment are ever going to report it because of the reasons that woman articulated. Because you're vulnerable to retaliation, you're going to be marginalized, you're going to be stigmatized. It's very difficult. So we need to clarify policies to prevent the harassment from happening up front. By the time you get to reporting it, it's too late. We have to transform our culture. And we know that the lowest rates of sexual harassment occur in organizations that proactively develop, disseminate, and enforce sexual harassment policy. We've also got to, for those who have clinical responsibilities, address the client-based sexual harassment that comes from patients and their families. Because ultimately, even though I have been talking about gender inequity in those positions of senior leadership and influence authority as the main focus of this talk, and of these as the causal mechanisms here are bidirectional, because these unacceptable behaviors thrive when there is gender inequity in the positions that are most influential. So we have to shift our thinking now as a group as we enter this open discussion where we're going to soon turn off the recording and be able to interact about what we can target in the water. What's making that iceberg form in the first place, right? Each person in this room, if you could pick one thing that's within your control, either at a local level or at a national level, to address, and trust your colleagues to pick a different one, just like we do in carcinogenesis. We target one thing. Pick your molecule of your target. Pick that. We could actually fix something that is incredibly complex, but not unsurmountable. We have to do something, because if we don't change that trajectory of progress, the current class of medical students who are over 50% female will have retired by the time we reach parity in those senior leadership positions. Again, this is not about fixing the women, it's about transforming systems. We have to have recognition and changes at the institutional level. I really, again, admire your new leader for coming in and saying, this is a priority. I've been here 1 year, and I am making this a priority for me as a leader. We need mentorship and sponsorship programs. That's not go find yourself a mentor, go find yourself a sponsor. That's let's all learn how to be better mentors and sponsors, and let's, as an organization, reward the time and the effort it takes to do that. Let's engage in evidence-based implicit bias trainings. There are some that backfire, but there are some that can be quite effective. Molly Carnes at the University of Wisconsin has developed one such initiative. There are plenty of cultural transformation initiatives and a need for transparent and consistent criterion-based evaluation, promotion, and compensation processes. We need to promote work-life integration, and increasingly, as we've realized since the COVID pandemic encouraged maybe a little too much work-life integration, work-life boundary setting. We need creative programs that provide helping hands in the workplace for individuals who need to take a period of time out to provide care, informal care to family members and other loved ones. We need to make sure that our professional societies and our workplaces have capacity for on-site childcare and allow the already permissible, based on funder and federal government policy, expenditure of funds to support allowable dependent care expenses. Renee Shaw led a very important study that showed that although many funding organizations will permit you to bring along someone who's a dependent to a meeting where you're presenting work, not a single medical school among the top 50 had procedures in place that made that possible. Right before we went to press, she was at the University of California. The entire University of California system changed their policy. So this kind of work can make a difference. There's some other creative things like time banking that can recognize the unrecognized service that people provide in the workplace by giving them resources for whatever they need, whether that's at home or in the workplace. Social media is sort of a mixed blessing. We can try to take the best from it, which is to recognize that it creates spaces where people can recognize they are not the only. And so I think it can be a force for good. We can encourage and develop and promote those who want to become leaders by providing leadership training. And there are a number of national opportunities and increasing opportunities where individual institutions have realized, hey, we can only send 1 or 2 people to each one of these programs, and there's such a talent pool here. Let's create our own programs. And in fact, these are my 2 biggest current grants. Empower is an R01 that is actually a randomized trial of a scalable online leadership development intervention, and Impact is a cultural transformation U54 that we are developing to try to support greater equity within the profession and of the kind of research that we conduct. We know that COVID-19 amplified challenges led to a drop in authorship during the pandemic, but it also highlighted a lot of opportunities for us to do better. And so by highlighting those opportunities, it actually gave us a disruptive opportunity. It taught us that overnight, we were able to do things we had no clue we could do. We could deliver clinical care virtually. We could teach people virtually. I mean, these were things, if you had said those in early trial, in fact, Empower is it's a virtual leadership development application. We submitted it in January of 2020, so it's before the pandemic. And the whole limitation section was, no, trust us, really, we can do this virtually, really, we can do this. And it was reviewed in May. It got a perfect 10 on study section review. because we realized that we absolutely could do things we never imagined that we could do. And so we inhabit an incredible, momentous time and opportunity when we have the opportunity to move from awareness to action, embrace the principles that we all care about, and to apply a healthcare quality improvement framework here where we plan, do, study, act in a virtuous cycle that reinforces itself. So I want to thank you for your attention.